Good evening, dear friends, gathered from all corners of the world in this cozy darkness. I hope you've lit your favorite candle, perhaps turned on a quiet fan for that soft, background hum that's so wonderfully soothing. Now, prepare to let go of the modern world, its bright advancements and comforts, for today we will dive into a time when existence itself seemed a marvel, and survival, a true miracle. We will transport ourselves to a world where even a simple ailment could mark the beginning of a journey leading to the deepest horrors. Tonight, we'll tell you why medieval healers, people who were supposed to bring relief, would actually terrify you to your very core, and why an encounter with them would be one of the most frightening ordeals of your life. Imagine this. You awaken in a medieval bed, perhaps a rough mattress stuffed with straw, in a room where drafts easily seep through cracks in the walls. Light barely penetrates through a tiny window, and every movement you make sends a ripple of discomfort through your body. An unknown malady rages within you, perhaps a fever burning you from the inside, or a terrible ache clutching your insides, or strange eruptions covering your skin. You feel weak, and your breathing grows shallow. All around, there's the scent of dampness, of smoke from a hearth, and then, something else, heavy, reminiscent of unhygienic conditions and decay, a smell that permeates every corner of that era. You lie there, hoping for relief, for salvation, and then the door to your hovel or castle chamber slowly creaks open, and a figure appears in the doorway. This is your healer. But forget everything you know about modern doctors. Forget sterile offices, gleaming instruments, the reassuring scent of antiseptic, and a gentle voice promising ease. No. This man, or occasionally woman, is clad in rough, perhaps stained, garments. His hands, which are meant to bring healing, smell not of cleanliness or soap, but of something far worse. Perhaps it's the scent of smoke that has clung to his clothes, the aroma of herbs mingled with something nauseating, or maybe even the stench of putrefaction lingering from a previous visit. This isn't just an unpleasant smell, it's a calling card of a world where the concept of hygiene was almost non-existent, where knowledge of microbes had yet to emerge, and where filth was a constant companion to life. This is not a nightmare. This would have been your reality if you had fallen ill in the Middle Ages. And what this man, your healer, was about to do would make you beg for mercy, for a swift end to your suffering, for his methods were often as agonizing as they were ineffective, if not fatal. Imagine, you feel utterly helpless. Your body is failing you, and the person who is supposed to aid you seems more perilous than the illness itself. You realize your chances of recovery are slim, and the likelihood of the treatment worsening your condition is alarmingly high. Because medieval medicine, despite all the dedication and, perhaps, sincere intentions of some healers, was based on utterly flawed notions about the human body and the causes of ailments. They didn't know what microbes were, had no concept of viruses, bacteria, or even how most of our internal organs functioned. Their knowledge was a blend of ancient Greek theories, often misinterpreted, superstitions, astrological beliefs, and religious dogmas. That's why their healer's space was a place where the patient felt completely powerless, and diagnosis seemed a bizarre ritual with little connection to logic. They believed in four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and considered any malady to be the result of an imbalance of these fluids within your body. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? Simple enough to understand, and abstract enough to conceal a complete lack of scientific evidence. But what did they do to restore this balance? They employed methods that would make you shudder. Imagine the healer taking a glass vessel into his hands, and then, carefully examining your excretions, making a grave pronouncement about whether you were destined to live or not. Or perhaps he would unfurl a parchment, gazing at the alignment of stars to determine if the time was favorable or not for treatment. These were not scientific methods, they were steps into the dark, leading to even greater darkness. And if you are listening to this now, feeling the warmth and comfort in your modern home, think about this. You, with your contemporary understanding of hygiene, accustomed to anesthesia, antibiotics, and precise diagnoses, would not survive a week in that medical environment. Even the slightest cut, the simplest cold, which for us is a minor inconvenience, were then potentially fatal threats. Your body, unprepared for such a multitude of infections, bacteria, and parasites, would simply succumb. Your psyche, accustomed to rational explanations, would be crushed by the ignorance and discomfort that prevailed around you. This narrative is not merely a historical excursion. It is a reminder of how fragile life was, how limited knowledge was, and how much we should cherish every day when our doctor offers us a clean pill, not a potion made from ground beetles. This is a descent into a world where even the hope of healing was a hope for a miracle, bordering on a nightmare. Prepare yourselves, for next we will unveil every aspect of this medical horror, piece by terrifying piece. We will begin with the most popular and perilous practice, the draining of vital fluids, which often led to fatal outcomes. Stay with us, for the night is just beginning, and the stories that will make you truly appreciate the modern world are only just beginning to unfold. We left you in a world where your healer, instead of modern knowledge, offered only riddles, and your condition was examined not under a microscope, but by the shadow of your excretions. And now, as you lie there, weakened by illness, fully aware of the helplessness of the situation, the healer makes a decision. He believes that the source of your indisposition is an imbalance, an excess of certain fluids within your body. According to their theory, the human body was governed by 4 primary humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if one of these was in excess, it led to an ailment. Sounds logical, doesn't it? Simple enough to grasp, and abstract enough to conceal a complete lack of scientific evidence. But what did they do to restore this balance? They regulated these fluids. And the most popular, most widespread, and, most horrifyingly, most often fatal method of such regulation was what we today refer to as the draining of vital fluids. Imagine this moment. You feel weak, your head spins with fever, every muscle aches, and your healer, with a calm, almost ritualistic expression, prepares his instruments. This is not a sterile syringe, carefully drawing a sample for analysis. This is a sharp, perhaps rusty, object, a lancet, a specialized knife, or perhaps you see him retrieve slippery, wriggling leeches from a container. If you are afraid of discomfort, if you cannot bear even the thought of your body being subjected to such external influence, this story will make you clench your teeth, for in the Middle Ages, this was not just a treatment, it was the primary medical procedure, applied to almost everything. From a common cold to the most terrifying epidemics, from a headache to mental disturbances, the answer was always the same: remove the excess. This procedure was performed anywhere, on the floor of a dirty hovel, in the cool room of a castle, in a monastic cell, or even outdoors. Barbers, who were not only hairdressers but also surgeons and dentists of that era, were the main practitioners of this dreadful custom. They took on the role of those who cleansed the organism, opened the body to release the illness. And they did so without any understanding of what was truly happening inside. They knew nothing about the volume of fluids in the body, about the role of blood in carrying oxygen, about the infections that could enter through unsterilized instruments. For them, it was simply water flowing from a rotten fruit, which needed to be released for the fruit to become fresh. There were even special calendars, linked to astrology, that indicated favorable and unfavorable days for such a procedure. Today the moon is in Scorpio, time to release excess bile, a healer might say, and you, without any doubt, would comply, believing it was your only chance for salvation. This deeply ingrained myth of the four humors persisted for centuries, despite all evidence of its ineffectiveness. Why? Because no other theory existed that could explain all illnesses. And so, when a patient felt temporary relief from a drop in pressure, or simply from a placebo effect, it was considered proof of success. And when the patient felt worse, or their life path concluded, it was attributed to God's will, the power of the illness, or seeking help too late. Never to the method itself. Imagine the stories of those unfortunate souls whose lives were cut short precisely by this treatment. A young woman suffering from a fever, whom the healer decided to cleanse, and she weakened to such an extent that she could no longer resist the illness. A warrior who sustained an injury in battle, and then, to expel bad fluids, had so much vital fluid drain that his body could not withstand the double impact. Or even members of royal families who, despite having access to the best healers, perished precisely from excessive fluid loss, even though their bodies were already weakened by the ailment. Each such procedure was a gamble where the stake was your very existence, and the chances of winning were meager. And what is most terrifying, after such a procedure, the wound made by an unsterilized instrument often became infected. Bacteria, of which no one had knowledge, freely penetrated the body, causing even greater complications, suppuration, gangrene, sepsis, that is, an infection spreading throughout the body, inevitably leading to a fatal conclusion. So, even if you were lucky and did not exhaust yourself to the end, you could receive a new, even more terrifying threat that slowly but surely took your life. This was life in constant fear of the unknown, where every indisposition turned into a dreadful ordeal. Where people sincerely believed they were being helped, although in reality, their healers, with the best of intentions, often hasten their approach to the final threshold, instead of moving them away from it. And this is just the beginning of our immersion into the world of medieval medicine. Stay with us, for next we will tell you how healers made diagnoses by looking at what today seems utterly absurd, your excretions and the alignment of the stars. We've already seen how medieval healers, with their crude tools and lack of genuine understanding, were ready to regulate your vital fluids, even if it led to dire consequences. But before resorting to such drastic measures, they first needed to figure out what exactly was ailing you. How did they diagnose? Forget about complex laboratory tests, about modern machines peering inside your body, or detailed symptom questionnaires. No. In the Middle Ages, your healer, standing by your bedside, would deduce your condition by observing something far simpler, something each of us produces daily. He would intensely scrutinize your bodily excretions. Imagine this: you lie there, feeling weak, every movement causing discomfort, and then, the healer approaches, holding a vessel. Within this vessel, your excretions. And for him, this isn't just a biological fluid. It is a map of your internal state, a coded message from your body. They called this uroscopy, and it was one of the primary, if not the main, diagnostic practices of that era. Healers would assess the fluid's color, from pale straw to dark red or even black. They paid attention to its clarity, the presence of sediment, its consistency. Some even smelled it, and a few, as stories tell, even dared to taste it, believing it indicated certain ailments, such as sugar sickness, though, of course, without any comprehension of its true nature. To us, this sounds like a wild, even absurd ritual. But for the medieval healer, this was the pinnacle of their knowledge. There were even specialized diagnostic circles or urine wheels, where each shade corresponded to a specific illness or a humoral imbalance. If your excretions were too red, it indicated an excess of blood. If they were yellow, a problem with bile. Seemingly simple logic, requiring no complex research, yet its fallacy was absolute. For the color of bodily fluids can change due to many factors unrelated to dangerous ailments, and the humors themselves were, as we now know, a fabricated concept. But that's not all. If uroscopy didn't provide a complete picture, or if the healer sought deeper insight, he would turn to another, no less mystical science, astrological medicine. He would unroll his charts, depicting the movements of planets and stars, and try to correlate them with your condition. For it was believed that every organ in your body was linked to a specific zodiac sign or planet. If your heart ached, and the stars were unfavorably aligned for the sign of Leo, which was associated with the heart, it was considered confirmation of the diagnosis. The time of day, the day of the week, the month, everything mattered. And healers might refuse treatment if the stars were not properly aligned, claiming it was simply beyond their control. They were loyal to the heavens, not the facts. Imagine this paradox: your internal organs were less significant to them than the color of your bodily fluids or the position of celestial bodies. Yet they had no means to verify these theories. They couldn't look inside the body, as dissecting human bodies was generally forbidden by the church and society, considered blasphemous and disrespectful to the deceased. Therefore, all their knowledge of anatomy was based on ancient texts, often riddled with errors, or on observations of animals, which, understandably, did not provide an accurate understanding of human bodily structure. Thus, diagnosis was often a blind guess, founded on false assumptions. From this stemmed utterly incorrect, and at times fatal, treatments. If a healer decided you had an excess of yellow bile, he might prescribe strong laxatives that dehydrated the body, or excessive fluid draining. If he saw a problem with black bile, which was associated with melancholy and sadness, he might prescribe emetic herbs to cleanse the body of this bad fluid. And all this happened in complete darkness regarding the true causes of ailments. The consequences: a person suffering from a simple infection, which caused a change in the color of their excretions, might be treated in a way that only worsened their condition. Someone needing rest and quiet would receive aggressive procedures that further exhausted them. This cycle of ignorance, compounded by a sincere belief in false theories, was one of the most terrifying traps of medieval medicine. People believed because they had no other choice, because hope is the last thing to leave a person. And they were willing to trust the strangest methods if the healer was convincing enough, and his stars were favorable. Stay with us, for next we will delve into even more dreadful aspects of this world. Prepare for a story about medieval medical interventions, procedures performed without pain relief, in unsanitary conditions, and from which your breath would catch. The night is still long, and it will bring us new, astonishing tales of ancient times. We have explored the realm of medieval diagnosis, a world where the color of your bodily fluids and the alignment of distant stars held more sway than any true understanding of the human body. Yet, despite their often misguided conclusions, there were times when the healers decided that passive observation was no longer enough. There were moments when they deemed it necessary to physically intervene, to delve into the ailing body itself. And here, dear listener, is where the true horror of medieval medicine truly takes shape. If you have any sensitivity to profound discomfort or the thought of unsterile conditions, this next part will challenge you, for we are about to describe medical procedures that would, quite literally, take your breath away. Imagine this: you've suffered a grievous injury. Perhaps a shattered limb from a fall, a deep wound from an accident, or an internal issue causing unbearable agony. Your healer, having made his diagnosis based on the aforementioned peculiar methods, now stands over you. There is no concept of anesthesia as we know it today. No gentle injection to lull you into unconsciousness, no gas to numb your senses. The only pain relief available might be a strong concoction of herbs, perhaps alcohol, or simply brute force to restrain you. You are acutely aware of everything. Every sensation, every agonizing moment, will be etched into your memory. The operating room itself is far from what you envision. It is likely a dimly lit, unsanitary space, perhaps a corner of your home, a public hall, or a makeshift area in a monastery. Dirt is prevalent. There are no sterilized surfaces, no clean cloths, no understanding of microscopic threats. The instruments themselves are even more unsettling. Forget the gleaming, precision tools of modern surgery. Instead, imagine rough, heavy implements, perhaps designed for carpentry or butchering, now repurposed for the human body. An unclean knife, a pair of rusty pincers, a crude saw, these are the implements of medieval medical intervention. One of the most common and truly agonizing procedures was the removal of stones, often from the bladder, a condition known as lithotomy. Picture the immense pain caused by such stones, and then imagine a procedure to extract them without any effective means of pain relief. The patient would be forcefully restrained, often by several strong assistants, as the healer attempted to remove the stone, a process that was brutal, agonizing, and often unsuccessful, leading to severe internal damage and infection. The screams of the patient would echo, not just from the immediate discomfort, but from the realization that this was their only chance, a chance that might well lead to their final, agonizing moments. Amputations were another dreadful reality. If a limb was gangrenous, crushed beyond repair, or severely infected, the only solution was to remove it. Again, without anesthesia. The patient would be held down, and the limb would be severed with a saw or a heavy knife. The immediate shock and immense fluid loss were often enough to cause a rapid decline. And even if the individual survived the initial trauma, the raw, open wound, exposed to the unsanitary environment and the unsterile instruments, would almost certainly become a breeding ground for rampant infection, often leading to a slow and agonizing decline, a fever that consumed them, or a putrefaction that spread throughout the body. The level of fatal outcomes from these procedures was incredibly high. It wasn't just the initial trauma, it was the subsequent complications. Infection, unchecked fluid loss, profound shock, these were common pathways to the end of one's journey. Even if the intervention was technically successful in removing the immediate problem, life afterwards was often marked by debilitating weakness, chronic discomfort, or a lingering infection that would eventually claim the individual. The healers of the time believed they were saving lives, but their lack of understanding about sterile practices and pain management meant they were often, unwittingly, accelerating the end. This stark reality of medieval medical interventions paints a chilling picture. It reveals a world where the act of seeking help for a physical ailment could transform into a brutal and terrifying ordeal. It highlights the sheer resilience, or perhaps desperation, of those who endured such procedures, holding on to a sliver of hope in a world devoid of true medical understanding. And it underscores just how precious our modern advancements truly are, how far we have come from a time when the hands meant to heal could inflict such unimaginable suffering. Stay with us, as we continue our journey into the unsettling past. Next we will explore the very medicines they prescribed, which could prove even more dangerous than the ailments themselves. We've journeyed through the terrifying landscape of medieval diagnosis, where a glance at your bodily fluids and the stars dictated your fate, and through the brutal realities of their physical interventions, performed without mercy or true knowledge. But what happened after a diagnosis, or after a procedure that likely left you more vulnerable than before? The healer, with his pronouncements, would then turn to his pharmacy, a collection of medicines designed to restore balance, expel bad humors, or simply alleviate discomfort. And here, dear listener, we step into a realm where the supposed cures were often far more perilous than the ailments themselves. Imagine being offered a concoction that, if you were to encounter it today, would trigger immediate alarm. Your modern medicine cabinet holds neatly packaged pills, scientifically tested and precisely dosed. The medieval apothecary, however, was a place of bewildering and often disturbing ingredients. Forget the clean lines and sterile packaging. This space would be filled with dried herbs, certainly, some of which held true medicinal properties, but many others were either useless or outright toxic. But beyond the plant matter, the shelves would hold substances that would make your stomach churn, animal parts, ground to powder or preserved in jars, often chosen for their symbolic, rather than actual, therapeutic value. Parts of exotic beasts, or even more disturbing, elements believed to be of human origin. Consider the remedies themselves. One widely believed cure involved the consumption of mumia, a powder made from ancient human remains, often imported from Egypt. The belief was that the vitality of the deceased, particularly pharaohs or mummified bodies, could be transferred to the ailing. Imagine being presented with such a medicine, expected to ingest the finely ground remnants of a human being. Or perhaps the healer would prescribe something even more inherently dangerous, like mercury, lead, or arsenic. These substances, in minute doses, were sometimes believed to have purgative or balancing effects. Yet, in the hands of someone with no understanding of toxicology or precise measurement, they were potent poisons, guaranteed to cause severe internal distress, neurological damage, and ultimately, a painful and irreversible decline. Other medicines included animal excrements, believed to hold some arcane power to expel illness. Ground-up insects, believed to draw out evil spirits or bad humors. Or even precious stones and metals, like powdered gold or silver, consumed in the belief that their inherent value would translate into health, yet providing absolutely no benefit and potentially causing harm. These concoctions were not prepared in sterile laboratories. They were often mixed in crude vessels, susceptible to contamination, and the ingredients themselves were of dubious quality, sometimes adulterated, sometimes simply misidentified. Why did people accept these medicines? Because there was no alternative, and because hope, as we've discussed, is a powerful force. The placebo effect, where a patient believes a treatment will work and experiences real, though temporary, relief, was undoubtedly a factor. And when the cure failed, it was never the medicine's fault. It was always the strength of the ailment, the will of a higher power, or the sinner's resistance to the treatment. The wealthy often paid exorbitant sums for the rarest and most exotic of these medicines, believing that cost equated to efficacy, only to become victims of the most dangerous, yet ostensibly prestigious, cures. The consequences of ingesting these perilous potions were manifold. At best, nothing happened. At worst, the medicine triggered violent purging, extreme vomiting and diarrhea, which was sometimes seen as a sign that the bad humors were leaving the body, but in reality, led to severe dehydration and further weakening. Or, the internal damage caused by heavy metals and other toxins would slowly but surely break down the body's systems, leading to a lingering, agonizing path toward the end of one's journey. So, the medieval pharmacy was not a place of healing, but often a chamber of slow, self-inflicted harm, where trust and flawed beliefs sealed one's fate. This chilling reality reminds us that in a time devoid of scientific understanding, the line between medicine and poison was not just blurred, it was often non-existent. The desperation for relief drove people to consume substances that today we would recoil from in horror. Stay with us as we continue our descent into the past, for next, we will explore the terrifying figure who emerged during the darkest times of plague, a healer whose very appearance struck fear into the hearts of those he was meant to help, and whose methods were perhaps even more alarming than the pestilence itself. We've journeyed through the unsettling diagnostic methods and the brutal interventions of medieval healers, witnessing their attempts to battle ailments with limited knowledge and dangerous practices. But imagine a time when the very air you breathed carried a swift and silent menace, an unseen foe that could sweep through entire cities, decimating populations with horrifying speed. This was the era of the Great Pestilence, the Black Death, and other devastating epidemics that gripped the medieval world in a relentless embrace of terror. During these darkest hours, a new, uniquely disturbing figure emerged, the pestilence physician. And if you thought the ordinary medieval healer was unsettling, prepare to be truly unnerved, though these specialized practitioners were, in many ways, even more terrifying. Picture this scene. The streets of your town, once bustling with life, are now eerily quiet, save for the desperate cries of the ailing and the constant, mournful tolling of bells for the departed. The air hangs heavy with the scent of sickness, decay, and the acrid smell of burning herbs meant to ward off the invisible contagion. Fear is a palpable presence, gripping every soul. And then, a figure appears, slowly advancing down the deserted lane. It's a person cloaked from head to foot in a heavy, waxed leather or oiled fabric garment, often dark and ominous. Their head is covered by a hood, and their face is concealed behind a mask, a bizarre, bird-like beak extending outward. The eyes, peering through glass inserts, seem distant, unfeeling. This was the pestilence physician. Their terrifying appearance was not just for show, it was their supposed protection. The long beak of the mask was filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and dried flowers, substances like mint, cloves, myrrh, or rose petals. The belief was that these strong scents would filter the bad air, the miasma, which was thought to carry the disease. They didn't understand that the true enemy was a bacterium, transmitted by fleas on rats, not a noxious odor. Their heavy clothing was meant to prevent direct contact with the sick, but it was far from impermeable and rarely, if ever, properly cleansed. The very sight of them, with their grim, alien appearance, would strike fear into the hearts of those they approached, a living embodiment of the impending doom. Their treatment methods were just as grim, and often just as ineffective, as those of their generalist counterparts. When they arrived at a household afflicted by the pestilence, their primary actions often involved more regulation of vital fluids, sometimes to an even more extreme degree, in a desperate attempt to cleanse the system. They would pierce and drain the painful, swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, that were the hallmark of the illness, believing that by letting out the pus, they were expelling the disease itself. They might cauterize these buboes with hot irons or apply strange, unhygienic poultices made of various substances, including ground-up toads or even human excretions, to draw out the infection. Imagine the agonizing pain of such procedures, performed on bodies already ravaged by fever and profound weakness. The open wounds created by these interventions only served as direct pathways for further infection, compounding the patient's suffering and often accelerating their decline. These physicians also carried a long stick or pointer, which they used to examine patients without making direct contact, to push people away, or to even whip the afflicted, believing that flagellation might purge the illness or appease a divine wrath. Their primary role, ironically, was often less about actual healing and more about counting the number of afflicted and the departed, documenting the grim toll the pestilence took on the populace. Many of these pestilence physicians themselves became victims of the very disease they attempted to combat. Despite their protective gear and their aromatic beaks, their lack of understanding about contagion, their crude methods, and the sheer virulence of the pestilence meant that exposure was almost inevitable. Their grim existence was a stark reminder of humanity's helplessness in the face of widespread contagion, a time when even the most specialized healers could offer little more than superstitious rituals and excruciating procedures, hastening the inevitable for many. The figure of the pestilence physician stands as a chilling symbol of an era when desperate fear dictated medical practice. Their methods were a grotesque blend of ritual, superstition, and crude, often harmful, physical manipulation. They represent the ultimate failure of medieval medicine to truly comprehend and combat the invisible enemies that ravaged their world. Stay with us as we continue our journey, for next, we will delve into the particularly vulnerable and often tragic world of women's health in the Middle Ages, a realm of taboo, shame, and often, profound danger. We have confronted the disturbing realities of medieval diagnosis, the brutal truth of their interventions, and the terrifying figure of the pestilence physician. Yet, amidst all these challenges, one segment of the population faced unique and often profound perils, intensified by societal taboos, a pervasive sense of shame, and a fundamental lack of understanding. We are speaking, of course, of women. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, the simple act of bringing a new life into the world was an ultimate gamble, a perilous lottery where the stakes were often your very existence. And the healers, who were supposed to assist in this sacred, yet dangerous, act, often proved to be more of a threat than a source of genuine aid. Prepare yourself to learn why the female body remained an enigma, shrouded in modesty, pain, and an alarming degree of ignorance. In an era where knowledge of anatomy was already severely limited, understanding of the female body was even more scarce, hindered by societal norms and religious beliefs that discouraged direct examination or open discussion. It was often considered impolite, even sinful, to deeply understand the intricacies of a woman's physiology. This profound lack of knowledge meant that many ailments specific to women were either misunderstood, misdiagnosed, or attributed to strange, almost mystical causes, like the wandering womb believed to cause hysteria, a term that literally meant of the womb. Imagine the frustration, the fear, and the sheer desperation of a woman suffering from a condition that no one truly understood, and for which the cures were based on fantasy rather than fact. For centuries, the primary figures attending childbirth were not formally trained physicians, but rather midwives, experienced women, often elderly, who gained their knowledge through generations of tradition and practical experience. While some were incredibly skilled and compassionate, others might rely on superstition or outdated practices. Formal male physicians, if they were involved at all, were usually called only in cases of extreme difficulty, when hope was already dwindling. The presence of a man during such an intimate and vulnerable moment was often considered shameful, adding another layer of distress to an already perilous situation. The act of childbirth itself was an ordeal of unimaginable proportions. Without any effective pain relief beyond perhaps a numbing herb or a strong drink, every contraction, every push, was endured in raw, unmitigated agony. The physical demands were immense, often pushing women to the absolute limits of their endurance. And the most terrifying aspect was the incredibly high rate of maternal and infant mortality. Infections, often introduced by unwashed hands or unsterile instruments, were rampant. Excessive fluid loss during prolonged labor could swiftly lead to a catastrophic decline. Even a seemingly minor complication, like a malpositioned baby, could become a fatal crisis, as there were few safe methods to intervene. Imagine the horror when a complicated birth necessitated an intervention. The midwives, and occasionally the male healers, possessed only primitive instruments. Forceps, if they existed at all, were crude and dangerous, often causing more harm than good to both mother and child. Aggressive manual manipulations, performed in desperate attempts to reposition a baby, could lead to severe internal injuries. The sheer brutality of these last-ditch efforts to save a life, without any means to dull the unbearable sensations, remains a chilling testament to the dangers women faced. For many, childbirth was a threshold, a moment where they stood poised between the continuation of life and its abrupt, sorrowful conclusion. Beyond childbirth, women also faced unique challenges in managing their general health. Reproductive health issues, menstrual irregularities, and other conditions were often met with a mix of folk remedies, dangerous purges, or simply outright neglect, again, largely due to the pervasive lack of anatomical knowledge and the discomfort with discussing such matters openly. The constant risk of infection, coupled with poor nutrition and the sheer physical toll of frequent pregnancies, left many women in a state of chronic vulnerability. Their lives, often shorter than men's, were frequently marked by profound physical discomfort and the quiet, stoic endurance of conditions that today would be easily managed. The narratives of medieval women's health are poignant reminders of the immense strides we have made in medical understanding and gender equality within healthcare. They highlight a time when societal norms, religious strictures, and a profound ignorance of the human body converged to make the natural processes of life, particularly childbirth, into an arena of immense peril and silent suffering. Stay with us, as we continue our journey into the shadowed past, for next, we will explore the equally fragile and often tragic world of children's health in the Middle Ages, where little lives faced immense threats from widespread illness and the limitations of care. We have explored the unique and often harrowing challenges faced by women in the medieval world, particularly during childbirth, a moment of profound vulnerability and peril. But the journey of life, if it continued beyond that dangerous threshold, did not immediately lead to safety and security. For if you were born into the Middle Ages, surviving infancy and childhood was, in itself, an even greater miracle than birth. The smallest lives were disproportionately affected by the pervasive lack of medical understanding, poor sanitation, and the sheer brutality of daily existence. Prepare yourself for a somber truth, for we are about to delve into the fragile world of children's health, where countless little lives were broken under the weight of medieval knowledge. Imagine a typical medieval household. Large families were common, not just by choice, but by necessity, a desperate hope that at least some offspring would survive to adulthood. Yet, for every child born, the odds of reaching even their 5th birthday were tragically slim. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, a grim testament to the period's challenges. New parents faced their joyful arrivals with a quiet, underlying anxiety, knowing that each precious life was a fragile flicker in a world brimming with unseen threats. And when a child did fall ill, the fear was immediate and overwhelming, for the available care often offered little genuine solace. Children, with their developing immune systems and smaller bodies, were especially vulnerable to the same perils that plagued adults, but with amplified severity. The constant presence of infections, diseases that swept through communities, and the scarcity of clean water and proper nutrition took a relentless toll. Conditions like dysentery, measles, smallpox, and respiratory illnesses, which today are largely manageable, were then swift and brutal agents of decline, capable of extinguishing a life in a matter of days. Their tiny bodies simply lacked the resilience to withstand the onslaught, and the remedies offered were, as we have learned, often useless or even detrimental. Consider the diagnosis and treatment of a sick child. Their small size, their inability to articulate symptoms clearly, and the prevalent belief systems meant that their suffering was often misinterpreted. A child's fever might be attributed to evil spirits, a bad humor imbalance, or even a divine punishment. The cures administered could range from harmless, but ineffective, herbal teas to dangerous practices like aggressive fluid draining, or the application of foul-smelling poultices made from questionable ingredients. Imagine a terrified, feverish child, subjected to such an ordeal, their small body racked with pain, while their parents watched on, helpless and desperate, believing this was the only path to a miracle. The lack of specialized care for children was stark. There were no pediatricians, no understanding of unique childhood diseases, and certainly no child-friendly hospitals. Sick children were often treated as miniature adults, subjected to the same harsh and ineffective treatments that brought little relief to their elders. Superstition played an even greater role in the care of children. Charms, amulets, and prayers were often deemed as important, if not more important, than any physical intervention. Folk healers might advise strange rituals, believing that a child's illness was a curse, a test, or a sign of supernatural interference. The profound tragedy of medieval childhood is difficult to overstate. It was a period marked by pervasive suffering, a constant backdrop of fragility, and the heartbreaking reality of lives cut short before they had truly begun. The loss of a child was a common occurrence, leaving indelible scars on families and communities, yet it was often accepted with a grim resignation as an unavoidable part of existence. There was simply no scientific framework to explain, prevent, or effectively treat the myriad ailments that preyed upon the young. This somber look into the health of medieval children highlights the immense progress we have made in understanding the most vulnerable among us. It forces us to confront a past where the promise of a long life was a distant dream for many, and where the innocence of childhood was often overshadowed by the relentless shadow of illness and mortality. Stay with us as we continue our journey into the uncomfortable truths of medieval life, for next, we will explore the universal torment of dental discomfort and the bizarre cures that made a trip to the medieval dentist a true nightmare. We've journeyed through the harrowing vulnerabilities of medieval women and children, where the fragility of life was starkly apparent. But there was one form of suffering that transcended age, gender, and social status, a torment so universal it affected nearly everyone at some point in their lives, yet for which the cures were as terrifying as the affliction itself. We speak, of course, of the dreaded toothache. If you fear discomfort, if the thought of a trip to a modern dentist makes you uneasy, prepare yourself, for a visit to a medieval tooth puller would make you truly appreciate every filling and every professional cleaning you've ever had. Imagine the onset of a toothache in the Middle Ages. It starts as a dull throb, perhaps a sensitivity to heat or cold. Slowly, relentlessly, it escalates into a piercing, constant agony that consumes your entire head, making eating, speaking, or even sleeping an impossible feat. There were no pain relievers beyond rudimentary herbal concoctions or alcohol, which might offer a brief, fleeting numbing effect before the relentless discomfort returned with renewed vigor. This was a pain that drove people to the brink of desperation, a torment that could last for days, weeks, or even months, eroding one's very will to endure. And what was the medieval explanation for this excruciating suffering? Often, it was believed to be caused by tooth worms, tiny, invisible creatures that burrowed into the teeth, gnawing at the nerve, causing the intense sensation. This bizarre theory, passed down from antiquity, meant that treatment often focused not on removing the decay, but on expelling these imaginary parasites. Imagine the absurdity, enduring immense discomfort, convinced that tiny unseen entities were devouring your teeth, and then being subjected to rituals designed to fumigate or lure out these non-existent invaders. When the pain became unbearable, and a tooth needed to be extracted, you turned to someone who was certainly not a trained dental professional. This task typically fell to the local barber surgeon or a traveling tooth puller. Forget the sterile environment of a modern dental office, the reassuring whir of a drill, or the gentle hand of a trained specialist. Your dentist would likely operate in a public space, perhaps a market square, using instruments that would make you cringe. Imagine a pair of rusty, unclean pincers, possibly meant for blacksmithing or other heavy-duty tasks, now being applied to your jaw. The procedure itself was a brutal spectacle. Without anesthesia, the tooth would be forcefully wrenched from its socket. The sounds, the sheer force, the accompanying cracking and tearing, would be horrific. There was immense immediate bleeding and profound discomfort. Infection was almost guaranteed in the aftermath, as the open wound was exposed to the unsanitary conditions and the unsterilized tools. Many people would lose not only the offending tooth but also suffer from painful swelling, further infection of the jawbone, or even more severe systemic complications that could lead to the loss of their very existence. Other cures for toothache were equally bizarre and ineffective. Poultices made from various herbs, some harmless, some irritating, would be applied to the cheek. Magical charms and incantations were common, with people believing that chanting certain words or wearing specific amulets would ward off the tooth worm or alleviate the pain. Some remedies involved placing ground-up animal parts or even strong acids directly onto the tooth, causing further damage rather than relief. The desperation for solace led people to embrace any proposed solution, no matter how illogical or painful. The grim reality of medieval dental care reminds us of the profound suffering endured by people for ailments that today are easily managed with minimal discomfort. It underscores the preciousness of our modern understanding of oral hygiene, the advancements in pain management, and the sterile practices that make a visit to the dentist a routine, rather than a terrifying experience. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes, the simplest discomforts of life can become monstrous torments in a world without science. Stay with us, as we delve deeper into the strange world of medieval ailments, for next, we will explore how they treated mental distress, attributing it not to the mind, but to demons and madness, leading to truly horrifying cures. We've confronted the widespread physical suffering endured in the Middle Ages, from the agonizing toothache to the terrifying perils of childhood ailments. But imagine a different kind of torment, one that didn't manifest as a visible wound or a raging fever, but as a silent, internal battle. What if you found yourself struggling with profound sadness, overwhelming anxiety, or experiencing perceptions that others simply could not share? In the medieval world, if you exhibited what we now recognize as symptoms of mental distress, healers did not see you as someone suffering from a complex neurological or psychological condition. Instead, they often saw something far more sinister. They saw you as being possessed by malevolent forces, afflicted by demonic influence, or simply succumbed to a state of madness. And their treatments for these invisible torments were often more horrifying than the internal anguish itself. Consider the prevailing worldview. In an era deeply steeped in religious belief and superstition, explanations for unexplained phenomena frequently defaulted to the supernatural. If a physical ailment couldn't be easily attributed to an imbalance of humors, and especially if the person's behavior deviated significantly from the norm, it was often assumed that evil spirits, demons, or even divine punishment were at play. This meant that individuals struggling with what we now understand as depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, or other mental health conditions were often viewed not as patients requiring compassionate care, but as objects of fear, suspicion, or even spiritual battle. Imagine the isolation, the terror, and the profound hopelessness of being labeled as demon-possessed when your mind was already a prison. The cures for such conditions were profoundly misguided and often brutal. Exorcism was a common practice, performed by priests or other religious figures, involving elaborate rituals, prayers, and often loud, aggressive commands aimed at expelling the demon. While some individuals might have experienced a placebo effect from the fervent belief, for many, it was a terrifying ordeal that exacerbated their distress. Imagine a vulnerable person, already struggling with internal turmoil, being yelled at, physically restrained, and subjected to agonizing rituals, all in the name of purification. This was not therapy. It was an act of confrontation with unseen entities, often leading to further trauma. Beyond exorcism, other treatments were more physically invasive. Trepanning, the practice of drilling a hole into the skull, which we discussed earlier for other purposes, was sometimes applied to those suffering from madness. The belief was that creating an opening in the skull would allow the evil spirits or bad humors causing the distress to escape. Imagine the sheer horror of such a procedure, being held down, fully conscious, as a hole was bored into your head, all to cure an affliction they didn't comprehend. The outcome was rarely positive, often leading to severe brain damage, infection, or a swift end to one's journey. For those deemed incurably mad, the treatment often amounted to confinement and restraint. They might be chained, isolated, or placed in dark, unsanitary cells, sometimes in the bacillus or in rudimentary asylums that were more like prisons than places of care. The goal was simply to contain the danger they posed to themselves or others, rather than to alleviate their suffering or understand their condition. Imagine the despair of being stripped of your freedom, locked away, and treated as an animal, simply because your mind worked differently. There was no concept of psychological support, no talking therapy, no medication to ease the internal turmoil. The narratives surrounding mental health in the Middle Ages are deeply unsettling. They reveal a profound disconnect between the suffering individual and the understanding of those around them. This period serves as a stark, chilling reminder of the consequences when ignorance, superstition, and fear dictate the approach to complex human conditions. It forces us to appreciate the revolutionary strides made in modern mental health care, where compassion, scientific understanding, and tailored treatments offer hope and dignity. Stay with us as we continue our journey into the uncomfortable truths of medieval life, for next, we will step into the apothecary of fear, exploring the truly revolting ingredients that comprise their medicines, and why you would recoil in horror from every single one. We've journeyed through the medieval landscape of physical and mental anguish, witnessing their desperate, often misguided attempts at diagnosis and intervention. But now, dear listener, we arrive at the place where all those theories and practices culminated, the medieval pharmacy. Today, your medicine cabinet smells of mint and citrus, perhaps a sterile cleanliness, filled with neatly packaged remedies designed to bring relief. The medieval apothecary, however, smelled of something far more unsettling, a pungent mix of decay, acrid fumes, and bodily excretions. Prepare yourself to discover precisely what pharmacists of those times offered their patients as cures, and why you would recoil in sheer horror from every single one. Imagine stepping into such a space. It's likely a cluttered, dim room, perhaps part of a healer's home or a monastic infirmary. Jars and pouches line the shelves, but their contents are far from comforting. While some might hold genuinely useful herbs like chamomile or lavender, the vast majority would contain ingredients that defy logic and assault the senses. The air itself would be thick with the aroma of dried animal parts, sometimes mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay or the sharp tang of fermentation. This wasn't a place designed for patient comfort, it was a workshop of strange alchemy, where desperate hopes met repulsive realities. Consider the common belief that like cures like, or that powerful, often unpleasant, substances held secret healing properties. This led to the inclusion of truly bizarre and revolting ingredients in their medicines. For instance, imagine being prescribed a cure made from powdered animal excrements, from dogs, from pigs, or even birds. It was believed that the impurities of these substances could somehow draw out impurities from the human body, or that their foulness would repel the illness. Think of the taste, the texture, and the sheer audacity of expecting a suffering person to ingest such a vile concoction, convinced it would bring them relief. Beyond animal waste, the medieval pharmacopoeia often featured other disturbing elements. There were remedies concocted from ground-up insects, such as beetles or spiders, powdered into a fine dust and mixed into liquids. The belief was that these creatures, living among the sick or associated with dark places, held some mystical power to combat illness or ward off unseen malevolent forces. Imagine the sensation of swallowing such a mixture, knowing its origins. Then there were medicines derived from human elements. As we've briefly touched upon, the concept of mumia, powdered ancient human remains, was shockingly prevalent, believed to transfer vitality. But sometimes, even fresher, more recent human materials, like hair, nails, or even parts of deceased individuals, were believed to hold curative properties, ground into powders or infused into strange elixirs. Moreover, the medicines were often prepared with little to no understanding of chemistry or dosage. Ingredients were mixed haphazardly, without precise measurements. Potentially toxic substances like mercury, lead, or arsenic, though not always identified as such, found their way into various remedies, believed to have purging or cleansing effects. Ingesting these heavy metals could lead to chronic poisoning, neurological damage, severe internal organ distress, and a slow, agonizing decline. Imagine a child, already weakened by illness, being given a spoon of a medicine that would, over time, quietly erode their vitality, all in the name of healing. The lack of any real scientific understanding meant that the medieval pharmacist relied on trial and error, superstition, and the authority of ancient, often incorrect, texts. If a patient recovered, the medicine was deemed effective. If they succumbed, it was the will of God, the strength of the disease, or the weakness of the patient, never the fault of the concoction itself. This cycle of desperate belief in unproven, and often dangerous, remedies highlights a fundamental truth. In a time of profound medical ignorance, any promise of relief, no matter how repulsive, was eagerly seized upon. The apothecary of the Middle Ages was not a place of comfort and cure, but a chamber of desperate hope, mixed with vile ingredients and profound risk. It serves as a stark, visceral reminder of how far we have come, and why we should truly value every sterile laboratory, every rigorously tested drug, and every precisely measured dose that defines our modern medicine. Stay with us as we continue our descent into the unsettling past, for next, we will explore the horrifying reality of hygiene in the Middle Ages, revealing why even a simple bath could have been a truly fatal undertaking. We've delved into the terrifying medicines of the medieval apothecary, concoctions that would make your stomach churn and your mind reel. But what about the basic practices that we take for granted every single day? What about cleanliness, fresh air, and the simple act of bathing? If you are afraid of germs, if the thought of microscopic life makes you uneasy, prepare yourself for a truly uncomfortable truth. Because in the Middle Ages, they didn't even know what germs were. Their understanding of cleanliness was so utterly lacking, so fundamentally flawed, that even a simple cut could cost you your very existence. Prepare to learn about a world where true cleanliness was a rare luxury, and infection was not the exception, but the grim and pervasive norm. Imagine your daily routine today: a hot shower, clean clothes, sanitized surfaces, perhaps a spritz of disinfectant. Now, erase all of that. In the medieval world, the concept of hygiene as we understand it simply didn't exist. Personal cleanliness was often considered a luxury, or even, at certain times, a vanity discouraged by religious dogma. Bathing was infrequent for many, sometimes seen as a breeding ground for illness rather than a means of preventing it. When baths were taken, they were often communal, in shared tubs filled with water that became increasingly murky, far from a source of purity. Imagine sharing bath water with several other people, some of whom might be carrying unknown ailments, in a tub that was rarely, if ever, properly scrubbed. The sheer accumulation of bodily grime was only one part of the problem. What truly set the stage for pervasive health perils was the complete lack of understanding of microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, and fungi. They were invisible, odorless, and utterly unknown, yet they were everywhere. They thrived in the unwashed hands of healers, on unsterilized tools, in stagnant water, and within the unclean garments worn for days, weeks, or even months. The medieval home, no matter its grandeur, was a breeding ground for these unseen invaders. Kitchens were often shared with animals, waste disposal was rudimentary at best, and fresh water, if available, was rarely treated to remove contaminants. Consider the consequences of this widespread lack of hygiene. A simple scrape from a fall, a minor cut from a daily chore, or even a splinter, Incidents we dismiss today with a quick wash and a bandage were then potential gateways to profound suffering and often a tragic end. The skin, our primary defense, was constantly breached by unseen pathogens. A cut would fester, turning red and swollen, then producing pus, signaling a local infection. But with no knowledge of antiseptics or antibiotics, that localized infection could rapidly spread, causing fever, chills, and then a systemic invasion that overwhelmed the body. Gangrene, sepsis, or other severe complications were common, relentlessly claiming lives from what we would consider minor injuries. And what about the larger environment? Cities, even grand ones, were often choked with filth. Human and animal waste was frequently discarded directly into the streets or flowed into open ditches, attracting vermin, rats, flies, and other carriers of disease. There was no organized waste management or sewage systems as we know them. The air itself, particularly in warmer months, would be heavy with the stench of decay and the buzzing of insects, each one a tiny vector for unseen dangers. Imagine living in such conditions, constantly exposed to an invisible enemy, unaware of its very existence, and attributing the resulting widespread sickness to divine wrath or astrological alignments. Even attempts at cleanliness could backfire. Public bathhouses, popular in some periods, could ironically become centers for the spread of certain skin conditions or infections due to shared water and close contact. The few available soaps were harsh and often ineffective against bacteria. The very water used for drinking and cooking was often drawn from contaminated sources, directly introducing pathogens into the body. This relentless, unseen assault on the human system meant that chronic illness, low-grade infections, and a general state of diminished vitality were the norm, not the exception. The pervasive lack of hygiene in the Middle Ages paints a truly unsettling picture, revealing a world where humanity was constantly at war with invisible foes it could not even name. It highlights the profound vulnerability of our ancestors and underscores the revolutionary impact of modern sanitation, germ theory, and public health initiatives. Every time you wash your hands, or drink clean water, or see a sterile surgical room, remember the medieval past. It is a chilling reminder of how easily life can be snatched away by forces unseen, and how fundamental cleanliness is to our very survival. Stay with us, as we continue our journey into the uncomfortable truths of medieval life, for next, we will explore the very foundations of their medical understanding, and why the human body itself remained largely a forbidden, misunderstood mystery. We've plunged through the unsettling realities of medieval medicine, witnessing their misguided diagnoses, brutal interventions, perilous potions, and terrifying lack of hygiene. Yet, beneath all these harrowing practices lay a foundational problem, a gaping hole in their understanding that rendered almost every attempt at true healing a desperate gamble. They simply didn't know how the human body actually worked. Imagine your mechanic trying to fix your car without knowing where the engine is, or how the electrical system functions. That's precisely how a medieval healer operated. Anatomy, the very blueprint of life, was often a forbidden fruit, and the human body remained largely a mysterious, impenetrable fortress. For centuries, across much of medieval Europe, the study of human anatomy through dissection was almost entirely off-limits. religious dogma and deeply ingrained societal taboos considered the cutting open of a human corpse to be a sacrilege, a violation of the sanctity of the body and an affront to the soul's journey to the afterlife. This meant that the primary source of anatomical knowledge was not direct observation, but ancient texts, primarily those of Galen, a Greek physician from the 2nd century AD. While Galen was brilliant for his time, his understanding was based mostly on the dissection of animals, pigs, monkeys, and other creatures, not humans. Imagine trying to understand the intricate workings of a complex machine by only studying a simpler, related model. This reliance on outdated, animal-based knowledge led to profound and widespread errors. Medieval diagrams of the human internal organs often looked nothing like reality. The heart was depicted incorrectly, the liver was often shown with multiple lobes, and the nervous and circulatory systems were barely comprehended. They didn't understand the true function of organs like the pancreas or the spleen, attributing them mystical or humoral roles. Imagine a healer attempting to balance your humors or remove a blockage when their mental map of your internal landscape was fundamentally flawed, based on drawings that looked more like fantasy than biology. When dissections were occasionally permitted, typically for educational purposes in a few burgeoning universities like Salerno or Bologna, they were rare, highly controlled events. These were not practical learning sessions for future healers. Often, a lecturer would sit on a high chair, reading from an ancient text, while a barber surgeon, with little to no anatomical knowledge, clumsily pointed at the corresponding parts of the cadaver. The emphasis was on confirming the ancient texts, not on correcting them or discovering new truths. Imagine trying to learn surgery by watching someone else, who barely knows what they're doing, point at a single, quickly decaying body, while a professor reads from a book written over 1,000 years prior. This profound lack of anatomical understanding directly impacted every aspect of medieval medical practice. How could they accurately diagnose internal issues when they didn't know where the organs were, or how they functioned? How could they perform any form of invasive procedure without causing immense damage, when they had no precise map of the nerves, vessels, and delicate structures beneath the skin? Their interventions, which we discussed earlier, were often blind undertakings, reliant on brute force and guesswork rather than precise surgical skill. The consequences, as you can imagine, were devastating, leading to high rates of complications, further suffering, and, all too often, a swift end to the patient's journey. The medieval human body was, in essence, a black box. Its inner workings were a mystery, shrouded by dogma and a lack of scientific inquiry. This wasn't for lack of intelligence or dedication among some healers, but a pervasive systemic barrier to true knowledge. It highlights a chilling paradox, that the very people tasked with preserving life were often working in almost complete darkness about the fundamental mechanisms of that life. This journey into the medieval understanding of anatomy is a stark reminder of the incredible advancements that have been made in our modern medical science. Every X-ray, every MRI, every detailed surgical procedure is built upon centuries of painstaking anatomical research that began only after humanity dared to challenge old dogmas and look directly inside the forbidden human form. It is a powerful testament to the power of scientific inquiry to unlock the deepest mysteries and ultimately, to save lives. Stay with us as we continue our descent into the uncomfortable truths of medieval life, For next, we will explore the terrifying reality of their places of care, the hospitals that were often more a final refuge than a place of healing. We've journeyed through the unsettling depths of medieval medicine, from the terrifying medicines of the apothecary to the profound ignorance of human anatomy. But what about the places where the truly ill, the destitute, and the dying sought solace and care? When you imagine a hospital today, you envision clean rooms, skilled nurses, advanced equipment, and the promise of recovery. In the Middle Ages, however, the institutions that bore the name hospital were often places of profound despair, acting more as refuges for the dying or as means of social control than as true centers of healing. Prepare yourself to understand why seeking admission to a medieval hospital might have been your last, most terrifying journey. Imagine the typical medieval hospital. It was rarely a dedicated medical facility in the modern sense. More often, it was an extension of a monastery, a church, or a charitable foundation, driven by religious duty rather than scientific ambition. The focus was primarily on spiritual care and hospitality for the poor, the elderly, and the sick. The very structure of the building might be a large, open hall, where patients lay side by side on straw-filled beds, often with little privacy or comfort. The air would be thick with the smells of human bodies, illness, and the pervasive stench of unhygienic conditions. This was not a place of recovery, it was often a final gathering point, a crucible of suffering where diseases spread with terrifying ease. The staff in these hospitals were primarily monks, nuns, or other religious volunteers, driven by piety and charity, but possessing little to no formal medical training. Their care consisted mostly of providing basic food and drink, offering prayers, and performing rudimentary acts of comfort. They didn't understand germ theory, so they were often unwitting carriers of contagion themselves, moving from one patient to another, inadvertently spreading the very illnesses they sought to alleviate. Imagine a pious, well-meaning attendant, unknowingly carrying deadly pathogens from one sick bed to the next, while you lie there, clinging to a fading hope. The treatments administered within these walls were, as we have explored, the same misguided and often dangerous practices of the era: fluid draining, foul poultices, and dubious herbal concoctions. There was no concept of isolation for contagious diseases, no sterilization of instruments, and no understanding of cross-infection. Patients suffering from infectious diseases, like the plague or leprosy, would often lie in close proximity to those recovering from a broken bone or a less severe ailment, creating an environment where the vulnerable were almost guaranteed to contract further, often fatal, illnesses. This was a place where you entered with one malady and often left with several, or none at all. Beyond the physical conditions, the psychological impact was immense. The medieval hospital was a place where hope often withered. Surrounded by the moans of the dying, the prayers for the departed, and the ever-present stench of illness, patients lived in a constant state of dread. The very atmosphere was saturated with suffering, a chilling testament to the fragility of life and the limitations of human knowledge. For those who were not fatally ill, the experience of being confined in such a place could be profoundly traumatizing, leaving them with mental scars as deep as any physical ones. For the destitute, the medieval hospital was often the only option, a last resort when family care was impossible. But for others, it was a terrifying choice, a place of last rites rather than recovery. Admission often signified a surrender to one's fate, an acceptance that the end was near. These institutions, despite their charitable intent, stood as stark monuments to medical ignorance, places where the best intentions were frequently undone by a lack of fundamental scientific understanding, leading to an environment that amplified suffering rather than truly alleviating it. The historical reality of medieval hospitals paints a grim picture, one that profoundly contrasts with our modern understanding of healthcare. It highlights a period where compassion often outweighed competence, and where the most vulnerable were subjected to conditions that often accelerated their decline rather than promoting their healing. Every time you enter a clean, well-equipped modern hospital, remember the medieval past. It is a powerful reminder of how far we have come in our ability to care for the sick, and how invaluable scientific progress truly is. Stay with us, as we prepare for our final descent into the uncomfortable truths of medieval life, for next, we will explore the last, most fundamental horror, the very limited lifespan of medieval people, and how their world was defined by the omnipresent shadow of mortality. We have journeyed through the grim landscape of medieval medicine, the alarming lack of anatomical understanding, the terrifying cures of the apothecary, the grim realities of their hospitals, and the pervasive absence of hygiene. Each step has revealed a world where health was a constant battle against unseen forces and profound ignorance. But now, as we conclude our descent into this unsettling past, we must confront the ultimate, all-encompassing reality that defined medieval life, the profoundly limited lifespan and the omnipresent shadow of mortality. Prepare yourself to understand why, for our ancestors, every sunrise was a fragile gift, and death was not a distant threat, but an ever-present companion. Imagine waking up each day in the Middle Ages. Your life, from birth, was a precarious journey. As we've discussed, surviving infancy was a monumental achievement, a statistical anomaly against overwhelming odds. But even if you navigated the perils of childhood, outmaneuvered the unseen pathogens of unhygienic environments, and dodged the dangers of brutal medical interventions, your existence remained intensely fragile. The average lifespan, when factoring in high infant and child mortality, hovered around 30 to 35 years. Imagine knowing, deep in your bones, that reaching your 40th birthday was a remarkable feat, or rare privilege reserved for a fortunate few. Death was not a taboo subject, hidden away behind hospital walls or sterile euphemisms. It was an integral, visible part of daily life. The bodies of the deceased were often prepared at home, mourned openly, and buried in local churchyards that served as communal spaces. The sight of a funeral procession was common, the tolling of a death knell a familiar sound. This constant proximity to the end of life meant that medieval people lived with a profound awareness of their own fragility. Every cough, every ache, every cut was a potential harbinger of the inevitable, a small reminder of their vulnerability in a world without antibiotics, advanced surgery, or preventative care. Consider the psychological impact of living under such a persistent cloud. It fostered a unique blend of fatalism and deep, sometimes desperate, religiosity. People often accepted their suffering as divine will or a test of faith. They sought solace in spiritual promises, for earthly relief was rarely guaranteed. This acceptance of mortality, while grim to our modern sensibilities, also allowed for a certain resilience, a focus on the spiritual journey rather than the ephemeral physical one. Yet, it also meant that they were often resigned to the painful realities of illness, with little expectation of true medical cure. The diseases that we now consider minor nuisances were then lethal threats. A simple influenza outbreak could sweep through a village, claiming dozens. A common cold could turn into pneumonia, a swift and final descent. Infections from childbirth, from a minor wound, from a simple tooth extraction, these were not anomalies but common pathways to the grave. The human body, lacking the defenses provided by modern sanitation and medical science, was constantly under siege, a delicate vessel navigating a treacherous sea of microbial threats. This pervasive reality of a short and often painful existence defined medieval society. It shaped their beliefs, their social structures, and their daily decisions. The concept of a long, healthy retirement, of decades spent in leisurely pursuit, was almost entirely absent. Life was lived in the immediate, with an acute awareness of its brevity and unpredictability. It reminds us that our modern lifespan, often extending into the 70s, 80s, and beyond, is not a given, but a hard-won victory of scientific progress, public health, and a profound shift in our understanding of the human body. As we conclude this unsettling journey, let us carry with us not just the grim details of medieval medicine, but a profound appreciation for the world we inhabit today. Every vaccine, every antibiotic, every sterile instrument, every clean glass of water, these are not merely conveniences. They are triumphs. They represent centuries of scientific struggle, of challenging old beliefs, and of bravely peering into the forbidden workings of the human body. The horrors of medieval medicine are a powerful, chilling reminder of the value of knowledge, the importance of inquiry, and the incredible, life-saving gifts that modern science has bestowed upon us. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark ages of medicine. May your night be filled with the comfort of our modern world. We have explored the unsettling realities of medieval medical practices, from their misguided understanding of the body to their horrifying cures, from the dismal state of their hospitals to the constant shadow of early mortality. But amidst all these challenges, there was one omnipresent foe, an invisible enemy that stalked every village, every city, every household, claiming lives with terrifying efficiency. This was the era before germ theory, before microscopes, before even the faintest whisper of what truly caused widespread sickness. They simply didn't know about contagion, about the microscopic organisms that invisibly passed from person to person, turning a simple cough into a community-wide tragedy. Prepare yourself to understand the true horror of living in a world where the air itself could be a silent killer, and every handshake a potential vector for doom. Imagine living your life in such profound ignorance. When someone in your family or village fell ill with a fever, a cough, or strange sores, the medieval mind often attributed it to divine displeasure, a planetary alignment, an imbalance of humors, or even witchcraft. The idea that a tiny, unseen entity could pass from one person to another, through breath, touch, or even shared food, was simply beyond their comprehension. This meant that the very measures taken to care for the sick, holding their hand, sharing a bed, or even simply breathing the same air in a crowded room, were often the direct means by which the illness spread, creating an unwitting chain of transmission that seemed to defy all logic. consider the devastating impact of this ignorance during outbreaks. When a terrifying disease like the plague, measles, or influenza began to spread, there was no concept of quarantine, no understanding of how to break the chain of infection. Families would gather around the sick, offering comfort, unknowingly exposing themselves. Neighbors would visit, carrying food, and then return to their own homes, bringing the invisible menace with them. Markets, churches, and public gatherings, essential for community life, transformed into unwitting hubs of contagion, accelerating the spread of sickness with every interaction. Imagine the terror of seeing your loved ones fall ill, one after another, seemingly at random, with no understanding of why, or how to stop it. The very air they breathed was a constant threat. Without ventilation in tightly packed homes, and with poor sanitation in the streets, airborne pathogens flourished. Water sources, often shared and easily contaminated by human and animal waste, became super spreaders for diseases like dysentery and cholera. Even common pests, like fleas and lice, which thrived in unhygienic conditions, were unknowingly carrying deadly bacteria, turning a simple itch into a potential death sentence. They lived in a world where every surface, every breath, every insect could carry a hidden peril, yet they had no way to identify or protect themselves from it. Their attempts to ward off contagion were as tragic as they were ineffective. Burning strong-smelling herbs, carrying posies of flowers, or wearing amulets were common practices, based on the miasma theory that bad air caused disease. People would seal themselves indoors, unknowingly trapping themselves with infected air and family members, or flee towns, inadvertently carrying the disease to new, untouched communities. These desperate, ritualistic measures, born from a profound lack of scientific understanding, often served only to accelerate the spread or deepen the despair. The consequences of living with this invisible enemy were profound. Life expectancies were brutally short, not just due to individual accidents or isolated illnesses, but because entire populations were periodically decimated by waves of unseen pathogens. Generations were shaped by the trauma of widespread sickness, the constant cycle of illness, and the grim acceptance that death could strike anyone, at any time, often without warning or discernible cause. It was a world where health was a fragile truce, constantly threatened by an enemy no one could see or comprehend. This final exploration into the medieval mind's blindness to contagion truly underscores the revolutionary shift brought by modern science. Every time you wash your hands, get a vaccine, or see a public health warning, remember the medieval past. Remember the fear of the unknown, the helplessness in the face of invisible threats, and the countless lives lost to what we now understand as simple, microscopic organisms. It is a powerful testament to the enduring human spirit to survive, but an even greater tribute to the power of scientific inquiry, which finally lifted the veil on the true nature of disease. Our journey through the unsettling medical history of the Middle Ages now concludes, leaving us with a profound appreciation for the comforts and knowledge that define our world today. Thank you for joining us. We have explored the stark realities of medieval existence, the terrifying lack of medical understanding, the brutal interventions, the perilous cures, the dismal state of their hospitals, the pervasive absence of hygiene, and the constant shadow of early mortality. We've even considered the profound psychological toll of living in such a world. But now, As we continue our descent into this unsettling past, we must confront another immense barrier to healing, one that often eclipsed any nascent scientific inquiry: the overwhelming, pervasive influence of superstition and deeply ingrained religious beliefs. Imagine a world where the very act of seeking knowledge was often seen as questioning divine will, and where the most devout intentions inadvertently locked humanity in a cycle of ignorance and suffering. For our medieval ancestors, the world was imbued with spiritual meaning. Every event, every triumph, and especially every tragedy, was often interpreted through a religious lens. Sickness, therefore, was not merely a physical ailment, it was frequently seen as a divine punishment for sins, a test of faith, or the work of malevolent forces like demons or witches. Imagine the crushing psychological weight of falling ill and believing it was because you had offended a higher power, or that an evil spell had been cast upon you. This spiritual interpretation often overshadowed any attempt at rational, physical treatment, directing efforts towards prayer, penance, or exorcism rather than effective medical intervention. This profound intertwining of faith and illness meant that medical progress was often stifled. Dissection, as we discussed, was largely forbidden because it was seen as defiling God's creation. Experiments that might reveal the true causes of disease were rarely, if ever, conducted, as it was considered presumptuous to question divine providence. The very idea of challenging ancient texts or established beliefs, even if they were demonstrably incorrect, was met with strong resistance, often seen as heresy. Imagine a brilliant mind of the era, perhaps intuiting a better way, but being forced to suppress their ideas for fear of societal or religious condemnation. Instead of seeking empirical evidence, many healers and the general populace turned to a bewildering array of superstitious practices. Amulets and charms, often inscribed with religious symbols or magical incantations, were worn to ward off illness or bring good health. Relics of saints were believed to possess miraculous healing powers, drawing pilgrims to distant shrines in search of a cure, even if the journey itself exposed them to further dangers. Talismans made from strange materials, like the teeth of specific animals or dried parts of plants, were carried or consumed, not for their chemical properties, but for their perceived magical efficacy. Imagine the desperation that would drive someone to clutch a bone fragment or swallow a ground-up animal tooth, hoping for a miracle that science couldn't provide. The line between medicine and magic was not just blurred, it was often non-existent. Astrological medicine, which we touched upon, was a prime example, where the alignment of stars dictated the timing of treatments, believing cosmic forces held sway over bodily humors. Dream interpretation, numerology, and even reading the entrails of animals were sometimes consulted for diagnostic purposes, intertwining the healing arts with divination and mystic ritual. This reliance on the mystical, while perhaps offering psychological comfort to some, fundamentally diverted attention and resources away from genuine scientific inquiry. The consequences of this pervasive superstition were profound. Effective treatments were often ignored in favor of rituals, and preventative measures were rarely adopted because the causes of disease were fundamentally misunderstood. This intellectual stagnation, rooted in deeply held beliefs, kept humanity trapped in a cycle of suffering that could have been alleviated much sooner. It wasn't malice, but a deeply ingrained worldview that prioritized spiritual explanations over observable facts, hindering the path to true understanding and effective care. This exploration into the complex interplay of faith and facts in medieval medicine is a powerful reminder of how human understanding evolves. It highlights a period where the sincere desire to find meaning and comfort in a chaotic world sometimes inadvertently obstructed the very progress that would have brought genuine relief. It underscores the profound impact of the scientific revolution, a daring shift in human thought that finally allowed empirical observation and rational inquiry to unlock the true mysteries of health and disease. As our journey through these historical horrors concludes, may this serve as a testament to the enduring power of questioning, observing, and seeking truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the profound lessons of our past. We've plunged through the terrifying realities of individual suffering in the Middle Ages, from the lack of anatomical knowledge to the brutal surgeries, from the foul medicines to the constant shadow of early mortality. We've seen how personal hygiene was virtually non-existent, turning even a minor cut into a life-threatening ordeal. But now, as we push further into this unsettling past, we must confront a broader, equally horrifying truth: the complete absence of anything resembling public health. Imagine living in a community where the very structures of daily life, the streets, the homes, the shared resources, were actively breeding grounds for sickness, turning collective existence into a constant, pervasive threat. Today, we take for granted the intricate systems that protect us: clean water, sewage treatment, waste disposal, food safety regulations, and public health departments that monitor and prevent the spread of disease. These are invisible shields that safeguard our lives. In the Middle Ages, none of this existed. Cities, even the grandest and most prosperous, were often unsanitary nightmares. Human and animal waste was commonly discarded directly into narrow, unpaved streets, creating open sewers that flowed through public spaces. Imagine navigating your daily life, walking through a pervasive stench, stepping over raw sewage, and living in constant proximity to the very waste products that carried deadly pathogens. Water sources were a primary culprit. Rivers and streams, which served as sources for drinking, cooking, and washing, were often the same waterways used for waste disposal. Wells, if present, could easily become contaminated by overflowing cesspits or surface runoff. The concept of filtering, boiling, or chemically treating water to make it safe was unknown. Imagine drawing your daily water, for yourself and your family, directly from a source that was almost certainly contaminated, unwittingly ingesting the very agents of dysentery, cholera, and countless other waterborne illnesses. The act of hydration was, itself, a gamble. Food safety was another terrifying blind spot. There were no regulations on slaughterhouses, no refrigeration to preserve perishables, and little understanding of how improper handling could lead to sickness. Meat, often butchered and sold in the open air, could quickly spoil, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria. Grains could be contaminated by rodents or fungi. Imagine consuming your daily sustenance, knowing that every bite could potentially carry a silent, unseen threat that would lead to agonizing stomach cramps, vomiting, and a rapid, debilitating decline. Food, the very essence of survival, was a constant source of potential peril. Waste management, or the lack thereof, was a pervasive problem. Beyond street sewage, household waste, including food scraps, animal carcasses, and human refuse, was often simply piled up in courtyards or thrown into rivers. This created perfect breeding grounds for vermin, rats, mice, and insects, which, unbeknownst to the medieval populace, were primary vectors for some of the era's most devastating diseases, including the Black Death itself. Imagine sharing your living space, or even your bed, with creatures that were unknowingly carrying death on their fur and feet, spreading it throughout your home and community. The air quality, even outdoors, was far from what we would consider healthy. The burning of wood and charcoal for heating and cooking filled homes and cities with smoke and soot, contributing to respiratory ailments. Industrial activities, though rudimentary, also polluted the air and water, impacting the health of workers and nearby residents. Without knowledge of ventilation or air purification, people were constantly breathing in particulate matter and noxious fumes that silently undermined their health. This profound absence of public health infrastructure meant that entire communities were perpetually vulnerable. Disease was not just an individual misfortune, it was a communal threat, constantly circulating, constantly preying on the weak and the unsuspecting. The lack of collective understanding and organized action meant that populations were trapped in a cycle of widespread sickness, unable to break free from the very conditions they inadvertently created. It was a world where the fabric of society itself, through its very existence, magnified suffering. As our journey through these medieval medical horrors concludes, let this stark reality of public health serve as a final, profound reminder. It underscores the incredible leap humanity has made, not just in individual medicine, but in safeguarding entire populations. Every clean street, every drop of pure water, every food safety label, every waste management system, these are not just conveniences. They are monumental triumphs of scientific understanding, collective action, and a deep commitment to the well-being of all. They are the invisible, yet immensely powerful, shields that protect us every single day. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the profound lessons of our past. May your night be filled with the deep comfort and safety of our modern world. Consider the dilemma of the medieval individual facing illness. Your body was failing, pain was your constant companion, and your very existence hung in the balance. You sought help from a healer, someone who was supposed to possess arcane knowledge, perhaps even divine favor. Yet, time and again, the cures failed. Fluid draining left you weaker. Foul poultices brought no relief. Potions made from disturbing ingredients offered only further distress. The very act of seeking medical help could be as terrifying, or even more so, than the disease itself. Imagine the psychological strain of entrusting your life to someone whose methods were often based on superstition, guesswork, and crude tools, witnessing countless others succumb despite these efforts. This repeated failure of medicine undoubtedly led to a profound erosion of trust. While some healers might have been genuinely compassionate, their ineffectiveness meant that hope often dwindled quickly. People learned to accept suffering as an almost unavoidable part of life, a test, or a punishment, rather than a condition that could be definitively treated. This resignation became a coping mechanism, but it also fostered a deep-seated fatalism. Why invest hope, resources, or even physical endurance in a cure that was so likely to fail? This widespread fatalism, born from medical impotence, permeated society, impacting everything from individual will to broader community responses to outbreaks. The limited understanding also meant that healers often had to resort to promises that couldn't be kept. They might assure a desperate family of recovery, only to see their loved one perish. They might offer a strange concoction with fervent certainty, only for it to cause further harm. This cycle of unfulfilled promises, while perhaps well-intentioned, must have further chipped away at any residual faith in medical authority. Imagine the heartache of clinging to a healer's words, only to witness the inevitable, painful decline, leading to a bitter understanding that the path to wellness was shrouded in deceit, or at best, profound ignorance. This lack of reliable medical intervention also impacted social behavior. Fear of illness often led to suspicion, particularly during times of plague. Healers might be viewed with a mix of awe and dread, their presence a harbinger of either desperate hope or impending doom. Communities, lacking effective public health measures, might turn to scapegoating or isolated desperate acts when faced with widespread sickness, as there was no scientific framework to guide rational action. This breakdown of trust extended beyond the individual healer. It eroded confidence in the very ability of humanity to control its own destiny in the face of widespread ailments. So, the medieval person lived not just with physical pain and constant threat, but with an underlying current of psychological vulnerability, a profound uncertainty about the efficacy of help, and a deep-seated acceptance that when illness struck, the outcome was largely predetermined, regardless of any medical intervention. There was no empowering sense of medical agency, no belief in the systematic triumph over disease. The medical landscape was a terrain of false promises, where desperation often met a grim, silent end. As we conclude our unsettling journey through medieval medicine, let this contemplation of eroded trust and the absence of effective care be a final, poignant reminder. It underscores the monumental significance of our modern medical systems, built upon rigorous scientific inquiry, transparent communication, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Every time you trust a doctor, every time you take a prescribed medication, every time you see a proven treatment, remember the medieval past. It is a powerful testament to the enduring human spirit to seek relief, but an even greater tribute to the power of knowledge, which finally replaced false promises with genuine hope and the very real ability to heal. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the profound lessons of our past. May your night be filled with the deep comfort and safety of our modern world. We have delved deep into the relentless horrors of medieval medicine, witnessing the profound ignorance, the brutal interventions, the perilous cures, the unsanitary conditions, and the pervasive shadow of early mortality. We've explored the psychological toll, the erosion of trust, and the societal structures that inadvertently perpetuated suffering. It's a bleak picture, a testament to humanity's vulnerability in a world devoid of scientific understanding. But now, as we draw closer to the conclusion of our journey, it is crucial to recognize that even in the deepest gloom, flickers of light occasionally appeared. Even amidst overwhelming ignorance, there were rare moments of genuine, albeit accidental, progress, sparks of ingenuity, or simple acts of effective care that remind us of humanity's enduring drive to heal, offering a fragile glimpse of the future. Imagine a world where effective medicine was often a matter of sheer luck, yet sometimes, that luck struck. While most treatments were based on flawed theories, some natural remedies, passed down through generations, did possess genuine, albeit unknown, medicinal properties. Certain herbs, correctly identified and applied, could indeed reduce discomfort, staunch bleeding, or even possess mild antiseptic qualities. For instance, willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was used for pain relief and fever reduction, long before anyone understood chemistry. Or honey, with its natural antibacterial properties, was sometimes applied to wounds, providing a layer of protection, even though the concept of bacteria was millennia away. These were not scientific triumphs, but happy accidents of observation, practical knowledge stumbled upon through centuries of trial and error. Beyond the herbal lore, there were instances of practical ingenuity born from necessity. When a limb was amputated, the desperate need to stop the fluid loss was paramount. While cauterization was brutal, it sometimes did successfully close vessels, preventing an immediate fatal decline. Or, when a broken bone needed setting, despite the lack of X-rays, a skilled barber surgeon with years of hands-on experience might, through sheer tactile knowledge and intuition, manage to realign a complex fracture in a way that allowed for some form of healing, even if imperfect. These were not procedures informed by deep anatomical understanding, but by the raw, practical lessons learned from countless attempts, a testament to the perseverance of practitioners in the face of overwhelming odds. Consider the role of observation, even without scientific explanation. While their interpretations were often flawed, some healers were keen observers of symptoms and the progression of diseases. They might notice patterns, linking certain environmental factors to outbreaks, or recognizing the distinct characteristics of specific ailments, even if they attributed them to miasma or divine will. This meticulous, albeit misguided, observation laid some of the earliest, most rudimentary groundwork for future epidemiological understanding, patiently collecting data in an age before data science was even a dream. These were tiny, almost imperceptible steps, but steps nonetheless, towards a more empirical approach. Even the monastic infirmaries, despite their numerous shortcomings as hospitals, represented a foundational shift towards institutionalized care. While far from modern, they offered a place of refuge, basic nourishment, and spiritual solace for the sick and the poor. They were early, imperfect attempts to provide systematic care, driven by compassion if not by science, planting the seed for future dedicated medical facilities. The very act of gathering the sick in one place, even if it exacerbated contagion, was an early, crude form of public health, laying the groundwork for the idea that society had a collective responsibility towards its ailing members. These glimmers of progress, however fleeting or accidental, remind us that the human spirit, even in the darkest of times, continually strives for improvement, for understanding, and for healing. They were the faint precursors, the initial sparks that would eventually ignite the flame of the scientific revolution. They demonstrate that even when trapped in a web of ignorance and superstition, humanity's innate drive to alleviate suffering would, against all odds, find small pathways towards efficacy. As our journey through the profound truths of medieval medicine concludes, let these small triumphs serve as a powerful counterpoint to the pervasive darkness. They are reminders that progress, however slow or painful, is always possible. Every scientific breakthrough, Every medical innovation, every life saved today is built upon not just the grand theories, but also these humble, often accidental, beginnings. They underscore the enduring power of human ingenuity and the unwavering drive to conquer suffering. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary evolution of human understanding. May your night be filled with the profound comfort and safety of our modern world, built on the foundations of both the terrifying past and these quiet, persistent hopes.